June 23, 1944. The jungles of northern Burma groaned beneath the monsoon rain. 1,000 dripping leaves shivered with every artillery blast, while the ground shook as if the earth itself recoiled from the violence. Japanese patrols, hardened by years of bitter jungle warfare, crept through the mud expecting the familiar stalemate of attrition. But what they found instead defied their imagination. Just yesterday, the terrain had been impassable, a quagmire of flooded valleys, broken bamboo groves, and sucking swamps. Yet now, through the mist, the silhouettes of American trucks rolled forward, headlights dimmed, engines roaring, carrying supplies as if the jungle itself had opened a highway for them. Japanese scouts blinked in disbelief. Where there had been no road, now a gravel surface stretched across the mire, sturdy enough to bear tanks and convoys. The rain had not stopped, the mud had not dried, and still, an artery of war had been carved overnight. For the first time, the Japanese realized they were not simply fighting soldiers. They were fighting engineers who could summon roads out of nothing, and with them, the unstoppable weight of American logistics. The scene was unlike anything the enemy had expected. Japanese strategy relied on isolation. They believed the jungle, with its choking vines and endless rain, would strangle American advances, bogging them down until hunger and disease did the killing. But as dawn broke over the drenched canopy, they heard the sound of graders scraping, bulldozers growling, and dynamite splitting boulders. They watched in shock as men in soaked uniforms worked through the night, their faces streaked with mud, their hands blistered, sweat mingling with rainwater. Flooded streams became bridged with logs, cliffsides carved into switchbacks, and marshes hardened with gravel and crushed stone flown in by cargo planes. The jungle's defenses melted before mechanical willpower. Entire battalions could advance because engineers had created a path where nature forbade one to the Japanese soldiers observing from ridges and tree lines. It felt like watching sorcery. Roads, they believed, required weeks of labor, planning, and surveying. In their doctrine, mobility was limited by the environment, and the jungle was king. But Americans challenged that very law of nature. Every morning, a new artery appeared. Every night, convoys moved where no maps marked routes. The jungle was supposed to defend the empire, yet it was betraying them, tamed by men who treated mud, rock, and rain as just another enemy to be crushed. The transformation of the battlefield had a chilling psychological effect. Japanese platoons sent to ambush were disoriented. They planned attacks on convoys expecting delays, but those convoys never stopped. They launched assaults believing the Americans were trapped by rain-swollen rivers, only to discover pontoon bridges spanning them within hours. Scouts sent back reports that officers refused to believe. Roads exist where no roads existed yesterday. It was dismissed as exaggeration, but day after day, the impossible became fact. The very idea of what was feasible in warfare began to fracture. The enemy's assumptions of endurance, starvation, and guerrilla dominance in the jungle evaporated beneath the relentless scrape of bulldozer blades at ground level. The scale of the effort was staggering. The 823rd Engineer Aviation Battalion, among others, worked through monsoon nights without rest. Bulldozers crawled forward, their tracks hissing in the mud, as operators sat drenched and half-blinded by rain. Dynamite cracked the night as engineers blasted ridges into rubble, then shoveled it into gullies to harden pathways. Trucks dumped crushed rock, graders smoothed it, and rollers compacted it until convoys rolled in neat columns by sunrise. The jungle, once an ally of the Japanese, became a corridor of American steel. The enemy would strike at dawn and find the ground already changed, trenches filled, streams bridged, ruts repaired. It was a war fought not just with bullets, but with shovels, engines, and sweat. Imagine the view from a Japanese outpost overlooking a valley. Yesterday, the only passage was a knee-deep swamp. Today, through the curtain of rain, headlights pierce the mist as supply trucks thunder across a newly born road. Machine guns open fire, but the convoy keeps moving, protected by armor and momentum. Behind it, engineers continue to widen the path, unfazed by fire, building under pressure. To the enemy, it seemed less like warfare and more like witnessing a force of nature. The Americans didn't merely adapt to the jungle. They reshaped it, For frontline infantry, these roads were more than lines of gravel. They were lifelines. Ammunition, food, medical supplies, and reinforcements flowed where once there had been only mud and despair. Soldiers who might have starved found hot meals. Wounded men who might have bled out in the jungle found evacuation routes. Tanks that should have been stranded in quagmires now rolled forward, their treads gripping ground that hours earlier had been a swamp. It gave the Americans not just mobility, but a sense of inevitability. The war machine could not be stopped because behind every rifleman marched an army of engineers with bulldozers, drills, and dynamite, and the Japanese felt it. Officers sent desperate dispatches back to their superiors. The enemy advances faster than expected. Roads materialize from jungle. Yet the reports carried an undertone of awe and dread. They could not match this feat. Their logistics relied on human porters, oxen, and narrow jungle tracks. They had no equivalent to the American Engineering Corps, no endless convoys of machines and materials. Every new road was not just a physical path, but a symbol of industrial might, a reminder that America fought with factories as much as rifles. This first encounter with overnight roads planted a seed of fear. If the Americans could build highways through monsoons, what else could they do? The jungle, once a fortress, was no longer secure. Japanese troops dug in, clinging to ridges, preparing for attritional defense. But deep inside, they knew the Americans would come, not starving, not delayed, but supplied, reinforced, and ready, carried forward on roads that appeared as if conjured out of thin air. The war had entered a new phase, one where mobility was no longer dictated by nature, but by the will of the engineers who refused to let the jungle WWII by 1944. The war in Asia had reached a desperate turning point. Japan's once rapid conquests had slowed. Its empire stretched thin across jungles, mountains, and islands that demanded more than courage to hold. The Allies, led by the United States, had begun to seize the initiative, not only on the seas and in the skies, but also in the unforgiving terrain of Burma and the Pacific. These landscapes were meant to be natural barriers, obstacles too great for mechanized armies. Yet for the Americans, geography was not destiny. It was a challenge to be engineered out of existence. The Japanese army had built its doctrine on endurance. Soldiers were trained to march for weeks through jungle, carrying rice and ammunition on their backs. Supply chains were rudimentary, relying on human labor and narrow paths carved into the wilderness. To them, the jungle was an ally. It slowed tanks, drowned trucks, and swallowed artillery in mud. Victory depended on forcing the enemy into starvation, disease, and exhaustion, where the will to fight would break long before the spirit of the emperor's soldiers. But the Americans approached war differently. They believed in overwhelming logistics, in making sure every rifleman had not just bullets but food, water, medicine, and even mail from home. To achieve this, they had to defy nature itself. Where Japan relied on endurance, America relied on innovation. This clash of philosophies would define the campaigns of 1944 and 1945. Burma was a testing ground. After years of humiliation in the region, Allied command needed to reopen the land route to China, the Burma Road, severed by Japanese advances in 1942. Without it, Chinese resistance risked collapse, and Japan's dominance over Asia could solidify. The task was monumental. Terrain here was among the most hostile on Earth. Jungles dense enough to blot out the sun, monsoon rains that turned soil into rivers, mountains rising like walls, and valleys filled with insects, fever, and death. Japanese generals believed this natural fortress would keep them safe. Into this cauldron stepped American and Chinese troops, supported by something Japan had never faced before: specialized engineer units backed by endless industrial muscle. They were not glamorous. They did not carry medals on their chests or fly fighter planes painted with victory tallies. But they wielded bulldozers, graders, steamrollers, and dynamite with a precision and determination that made them as dangerous as any combat division. For every Japanese ambush, an American engineer had an answer. For every washed-out trail, they carved a new road. For every collapsed bridge, they built one stronger, faster, and higher. The contrast between the two armies could not have been sharper. Japanese commanders clung to 19th-century ideas of movement, relying on feet and muscle, while American doctrine was born in Detroit's factories. It was mechanized warfare carried into the jungle, trucks, tanks, and artillery, all made possible only if roads could be built to support them. This was the hidden dimension of the war, unseen in headlines but decisive in outcomes. The pace of American road building stunned even Allied leaders. General Joseph Stilwell, commanding in the China-Burma-India theater, drove his men with relentless pressure to complete the Lido Road, a new supply line from India into China. At first glance, it seemed impossible. The route cut through virgin jungle, across rivers with no names, and over mountains that reached into the clouds. But with every mile, engineers proved the impossible could be conquered. Bulldozers smashed through bamboo thickets. Chainsaws echoed where once only cicadas buzzed. Men dynamited cliffs, sending cascades of rock to create embankments. In places, the road advanced a mile a day, faster than Japanese troops could even register on their maps. Japanese scouts observed in horror as convoys appeared in regions that should have been impassable. Officers were briefed on American movements that defied logic. The enemy advances with full equipment where no trails exist. What they could not grasp was the sheer scale of American resources. Factories in the United States churned out not only weapons but also the machines of construction. A single Liberty ship could deliver an entire regiment's worth of bulldozers, graders, and cranes across the ocean. What Japan could not hope to match was not the courage of the men, but the industry that stood behind them. This disparity shaped more than logistics. It shaped morale. For Japanese soldiers, each march was an ordeal. Supplies dwindled, stomachs growled, and malaria thinned their ranks. For Americans, resupply came on wheels. Convoys delivered hot meals, fuel, and ammunition across roads that seemed to spring up overnight. Wounded soldiers could be evacuated within hours, while Japanese wounded were left to die along jungle tracks. It was not only a physical advantage, but a psychological one. The Americans fought with the confidence of men who knew they would not be abandoned. Yet this was not without cost. The men of the engineer battalions endured backbreaking labor under constant threat. Japanese snipers picked off bulldozer drivers. Mortars rained down on road crews. The jungle itself fought back with leeches, fever, and exhaustion. But still, the work never stopped. Officers kept crews working under blackout conditions, bulldozers moving by touch and instinct. By sunrise, another stretch of road would be open, another artery for the war machine. The broader strategic picture began to shift. What had once been a stalemate in the jungles turned into relentless pressure. Japan's hope of bleeding America white on the jungle floor evaporated. The Americans were not bogged down. They were advancing, supplied, and reinforced, their roads stretching like veins across conquered terrain. Every new road was a dagger aimed deeper into Japanese defenses, allowing artillery to be wheeled forward, tanks to support infantry, and entire divisions to be fed without pause. For Japanese soldiers who had spent years believing the jungle was their fortress, this was a revelation as terrifying as it was demoralizing. Their empire's greatest ally had betrayed them. Nature itself had been conquered, reshaped, and forced to serve the enemy. What they could not defeat in combat, they could not outlast in endurance. The jungle that should have been their shield had been turned into an American highway. The war in Burma was no longer just a struggle between armies. It was a clash between two worlds, one relying on endurance, sacrifice, and faith in the terrain. The other fueled by machines, innovation, and the raw industrial power of a nation thousands of miles away. And slowly, inexorably, the world of the engineers was winning to eye in the damp stillness of the Burmese night. As Japanese sentries peered into the rain-choked valleys, the secret to America's relentless advance revealed itself not through sudden explosions or massive offensives, but in the low, guttural roar of engines that never ceased. The hidden advantage was not a weapon of destruction, but of creation. It was the arrival of engineer battalions trained not just to fight, but to build, supported by machines that could reshape the earth itself. Where Japanese doctrine accepted terrain as immutable, the Americans treated it as malleable. Another obstacle to overcome with sweat, dynamite, and diesel. The heart of this advantage lay in the core of engineers, units that moved as fast as frontline divisions but carried tools as decisive as rifles. Their weaponry was not limited to M1 Garands or Browning machine guns, but extended to Caterpillar D7 bulldozers, Euclid dump trucks, Laterno graders, and Bailey bridge kits that could span rivers in hours. These were not afterthoughts. They were essential elements of strategy. Every forward thrust of infantry was matched by an advance in infrastructure, ensuring that no American formation advanced faster than its supply chain could follow. This doctrine contrasted starkly with Japanese methods. The Imperial Japanese Army, while disciplined and ferocious in combat, had little logistical depth. Supplies were often moved by hand, carried by porters, or packed on mules along treacherous trails. Roads, when they existed, were crude and temporary, vulnerable to weather and collapse. Bridges were makeshift, often washed away by the monsoon. Japanese planners saw the jungle as a wall that could stall or even trap a mechanized enemy. But against the Americans, it became clear the wall would not hold. The true secret was speed, not just in construction, but in the pace of transformation. Americans could turn impassable swamps into gravel highways overnight. They could raise a bridge over a raging river in less than a day. They could repair bomb-cratered runways while aircraft circled overhead, waiting to land. To the Japanese, these feats appeared impossible. Yet they were achieved by carefully trained units operating with industrial precision. Supported by a supply system that funneled endless materials into the theater, at the core of this miracle stood the Bailey Bridge, an innovation that became the backbone of Allied mobility. Lightweight, modular, and quick to assemble, it allowed engineers to span rivers that would have halted entire divisions. Panels of steel could be carried by trucks, laid out like giant Lego pieces, and bolted together under fire. A bridge strong enough to carry tanks could appear in less than 24 hours. The Japanese might destroy crossings, but by morning, another would take its place. Rivers, once natural moats, became meaningless. Then there were the bulldozers, the beasts of burden that the Japanese learned to fear. With their massive blades, they could carve switchbacks into mountains, flatten clearings for airstrips, and push through jungle at a pace no human labor could match. They worked in rain that reduced trails to rivers, in mud that swallowed boots to the knee. Their operators, exposed on open seats, became targets for snipers and machine guns, but they pressed forward, engines growling, blades cutting. Where Japanese soldiers relied on machetes to clear paths, Americans unleashed machines that devoured jungle faster than it could regrow. Even more astonishing was the coordination. These feats were not random acts of improvisation, but carefully choreographed operations. Radios linked engineers with infantry, artillery, and supply convoys. When a battalion needed a road cleared, engineers received word instantly, and machines were dispatched before the request was barely uttered. A collapsed bridge could be reported, replaced, and reinforced before the enemy even realized the crossing was open again. This real-time adaptability, powered by communication and logistics, magnified the effectiveness of the engineers. For Japanese soldiers on the receiving end, the hidden advantage felt like a nightmare without end. Ambushes that depended on stalling American convoys failed because the convoys never stalled. Defensive lines that relied on rivers or ravines collapsed when engineers erased the obstacle overnight. The very jungle they had trusted to protect them became a treacherous ground that offered no safety, because their enemy could simply bend it to their will. It was not just physical dominance, it was psychological. Reports from Japanese officers describe a growing disbelief, even despair, at the enemy's ability to summon roads, bridges, and airfields from nothing. Scouts would return with observations that were dismissed as impossible. The enemy has built a road where none existed yesterday. Yet within hours, the evidence thundered past in the form of trucks and tanks. Each new road became a reminder of Japan's industrial weakness. They could destroy, but they could not build with the same speed. They could fight, but they could not sustain. Behind this hidden advantage stood the might of American industry. Factories thousands of miles away had designed, tested, and shipped the machinery that now transformed the battlefield. Engineers were trained not only as soldiers, but also as mechanics, surveyors, and builders. They understood soil composition, drainage, and load capacity, details that determined whether a road would last a day or a season. Where the Japanese relied on endurance, the Americans relied on expertise. It was knowledge as much as machinery that conquered the jungle, and the scale was staggering. In the China-Burma-India theater alone, over 35,000 engineer troops labored to cut the Lido Road through mountains and monsoon. They built more than 400 bridges, laid hundreds of miles of gravel, and cleared thousands of acres for airstrips. By comparison, Japanese engineering units were sparse, under-equipped, and designed only for fortifications or basic supply trails. The disparity was as wide as the ocean between their homelands. This hidden advantage, this ability to conjure infrastructure overnight, was invisible to the casual observer. Newspapers back home wrote of battles won, islands captured, and enemy ships sunk. Few reported on the men who, soaked to the bone, bulldozed mountains under fire or who hammered steel into place while snipers cracked shots from the trees. Yet it was these men who ensured victory. Without roads, the rifles would have fallen silent, the tanks bogged, and the planes grounded. The true miracle of American advance was not just in combat, but in the unbroken lines of supply and mobility to the Japanese. This secret was devastating because it was not a single weapon they could counter, but a system, a fusion of manpower, machinery, and industry. It was a hidden advantage that reshaped every battlefield. By the time they realized it, the war had already begun to slip from their grasp, carried forward on roads that should never have existed, built by men who believed that nothing, not even the jungle, was beyond their reach. The rain hammered down on the corrugated metal roofs of forward engineer camps. But inside the machine sheds, sparks flew like stars. This was the true forge of American power in the jungle, not only the men who fought, but the tools they wielded. To understand the miracle of overnight roads, one must descend into the technical heart of the operation, the machinery, the materials, and the ingenious designs that turned theory into lifelines across hostile terrain. At the center of it all was the Caterpillar D7 bulldozer. Weighing nearly 13 tons and powered by a 95-horsepower diesel engine, its steel blade could push 7 cubic yards of earth in a single pass. In the hands of skilled operators, these machines became as decisive as any tank. They cut through bamboo forests, leveled embankments, and carved switchbacks up mountainsides. In Burma, drivers would run them for 20 hours at a stretch, pausing only long enough to fuel before plunging back into the mud. Their exposed seats offered no armor, and Japanese snipers often zeroed in on them. Still, operators worked with stoic determination, knowing that every yard gained by the dozer meant another convoy could roll forward. Supporting the bulldozers were graders like the Laterno model Tornapool, capable of smoothing and shaping raw earth into stable roadbeds. Euclid dump trucks followed, hauling crushed stone, gravel, and timber. These materials were not always readily available, so engineers became resourceful. They felled jungle trees, burned them into charcoal to dry the soil, and used locally quarried rock to reinforce embankments. Where marshes threatened to swallow vehicles, engineers laid down corduroy roads, logs cut, and placed perpendicular to the path, creating a rough but effective surface that could bear the weight of a loaded truck. Then came the marvel of rapid bridging. The Bailey Bridge, invented by British engineer Donald Bailey, was one of the most important innovations of the war. Constructed from prefabricated modular panels, each measuring 10 feet long and weighing 570 pounds, these bridges could be assembled like giant erector sets. Sections were carried by trucks, laid side by side, pinned together with steel rods, and pushed across rivers using rollers. With enough manpower, a bridge capable of supporting a 30-ton Sherman tank could be built in less than 12 hours. Some spans extended more than 700 feet, defying rivers the Japanese believed impassable. The system was so versatile that engineers could build double or triple reinforced versions to carry heavier loads or quickly dismantle and relocate them as needed. The technical mastery did not stop there. Portable sawmills followed the engineers, cutting planks from felled jungle trees to shore up roadbeds, build culverts, or craft pontoon decking. Diesel-powered pumps drained flooded areas, while dynamite and TNT cleared boulders too massive for blades to shift. Survey crews, armed with transits and leveling rods, worked day and night to chart gradients, ensuring that roads could handle the weight of convoys without collapsing under strain. Every detail was calculated: soil composition, slope stability, and drainage angles. Without such precision, the roads would wash away in the first monsoon storm. Airfields presented another technical frontier. Engineers could clear and prepare a functional landing strip in just 48 hours. They used pierced steel planking, heavy interlocking sheets of corrugated steel, to create temporary runways. Each sheet measured 10 feet by 15 inches, was perforated with holes to reduce weight, and could be locked into place by hand. Laid in sequence, they transformed swamps or jungle clearings into airstrips capable of handling C-47 transports or P-51 fighters. Japanese troops would wake to the sound of aircraft landing in areas they thought inaccessible. These fields brought supplies directly into the heart of the front and evacuated the wounded, further extending American reach. The sheer volume of equipment was staggering. In the China-Burma-India theater alone, the U.S. shipped over 8,000 bulldozers, graders, and rollers by 1944. Each was maintained with meticulous care by mechanic crews who could strip an engine, replace pistons, and have it running again within hours. Spare parts were stockpiled in forward depots. The system operated with such efficiency that broken machines rarely stayed down for long. Every piece of steel, every bolt and track was a testament to the industrial machine behind the war effort. Contrast this with Japanese engineering. Their standard bridging equipment, the Type B wooden trestle, required days to construct and was vulnerable to weather. Their road building relied heavily on manual labor, soldiers and press civilians carrying loads by hand, hacking paths with picks and shovels. Without the heavy machinery, their roads were narrow, fragile, and often washed out within weeks. The Imperial Army had no equivalent to the Bailey Bridge, no pierced steel planking, and no floodlights to illuminate night construction. Their doctrine valued endurance over machinery, but endurance alone could not turn a swamp into a highway. Radio communication amplified these technical feats. The engineers carried SCR 300 backpack radios and SCR 508 vehicle-mounted sets, linking them directly with frontline units. If a division encountered an obstacle, a washed-out bridge, a landslide, a collapsed roadbed, engineers received the report instantly. Machines and crews could be dispatched within hours, often working through the night under blackout conditions to ensure the advance resumed by dawn. This responsiveness was itself a weapon, denying the Japanese the delays they relied upon to regroup and counterattack. Factories in the United States were the unseen backbone. Companies like Caterpillar, Euclid, and Laterno operated around the clock, producing the machines that remade the jungle. Caterpillar alone delivered more than 50,000 bulldozers during the war. Bailey Bridge components rolled off British assembly lines by the tens of thousands and were shipped to every theater. Pierced steel planking was stamped from American steel mills, stacked in Liberty ships, and unloaded in Calcutta, Karachi, or Rangoon to be driven into the jungle. This constant stream ensured that engineers were never idle for want of tools. Every technical detail reinforced a simple truth: the jungle could not stop the Americans because they had mastered the art of building under fire. Roads were not just dirt and gravel. They were feats of calculation, logistics, and machine power. Bridges were not just spans of steel. They were lifelines connecting divisions across rivers and valleys. Airstrips were not just runways. They were arteries that kept men supplied and alive. The Japanese saw only the result: convoys moving where none should move, aircraft landing where none should land. But the secret lay in the numbers, the specifications, the machines, and the men who made them work. Japanese soldiers staring across a valley. It seemed like magic. In truth, it was engineering. And it was this technical mastery, multiplied thousands of times across hundreds of miles, that turned America's war machine into an unstoppable force, carving highways of victory through the heart of Asia's most unforgiving landscapes, the Normandy countryside. Once idyllic with rolling green fields and quaint stone villages, had become the staging ground for one of the greatest logistical undertakings of the Second World War. By mid-June 1944, the beaches had been secured, but the Allies faced their next monumental challenge: breaking out of the hedgerow country, a maze of earth embankments and thick vegetation that turned every field into a natural fortress. For soldiers who had just survived the chaos of the beaches, It seemed as though Normandy itself conspired to slow their advance, hiding German machine guns behind every wall and transforming farmhouses into strongpoints. Yet this was no ordinary battle. This was the moment the Allies sought to open a path into the heart of occupied France, a chance to turn their beachhead into a launching pad for liberation. The Germans understood the stakes just as clearly. For them, Normandy was the crucible where Hitler's Atlantic Wall had been breached but not yet broken. Reinforcements poured into the region, and the SS divisions, hardened from years of combat on the Eastern Front, arrived with ruthless efficiency. Hitler himself ordered that Normandy be held at all costs, convinced that a victory here could reverse the tide of war. To the German command, the hedgerows were not obstacles but advantages, natural defenses that could bleed the enemy dry. Panzer units lay in ambush behind every turn, and artillery rained destruction from well-hidden positions. The Wehrmacht would not simply retreat. They would contest every mile, every village, with ferocity. For Allied soldiers, the reality of hedgerow fighting was brutal. Units often advanced field by field, using explosives or tanks fitted with special blades to smash through the earthen walls. Each advance came at the cost of lives, and progress was measured not in miles but in yards. Accounts from soldiers described the claustrophobic terror of moving through dense terrain where visibility was limited to just a few meters. A sudden burst of German fire could erupt at any moment, and often did. American infantrymen recalled how their comrades would disappear into the tall vegetation, only for shouts and gunfire to reveal another desperate skirmish. In such conditions, even the most battle-hardened troops were pushed to their limits. Yet amidst the grinding stalemate, Allied ingenuity began to show. Engineers designed the Rhino tank, a Sherman fitted with steel prongs salvaged from German obstacles, allowing it to smash through the hedgerows and provide cover for advancing infantry. Artillery coordination improved, with pre-planned barges softening enemy positions before assaults. And, crucially, the Allies began to employ overwhelming air superiority, calling in fighter bombers to strike at German strongpoints with precision. The Germans, for all their tenacity, could not match the scale of Allied resources. Slowly, painfully, the tide began to turn. The struggle for the city of Caen became a symbol of this phase of the campaign. For the British and Canadians, capturing Caen was a primary objective, yet German resistance turned it into a prolonged and devastating battle. The city, once filled with medieval charm, was reduced to rubble as Allied bombers and artillery pounded it into submission. Civilians caught in the crossfire endured unimaginable suffering, hiding in cellars as the battle raged above them. For weeks, progress stalled as German panzer divisions fought tooth and nail to prevent a breakthrough. But every day the Germans held Caen, they drained their reserves, committing men and machines that could not easily be replaced as July wore on. The Allies prepared for the decisive move, Operation Cobra, spearheaded by the Americans under General Omar Bradley. Cobra was designed to smash open the German lines and allow for a rapid breakout from the bocage. The plan hinged on overwhelming firepower, a massive aerial bombardment intended to obliterate enemy defenses before the ground troops surged forward. On July 25, 1944, the skies over Normandy filled with Allied bombers, unleashing one of the most concentrated air attacks of the war. Fields and villages erupted in fire and smoke, and German units were left shattered, their cohesion destroyed. For the first time since D-Day, the promise of true momentum appeared within grasp. The American infantry advanced behind the bombardment, pushing through gaps in the German defenses. The Germans, already strained, could not contain the offensive. Tanks roared across the countryside, and infantry moved swiftly to exploit the breakthrough. What had seemed like an endless stalemate suddenly transformed into a rout. Entire German formations began to crumble, retreating under relentless pressure. By the end of July, the Allies had broken free from the hedgerows, and the open plains of France stretched before them. The breakout had begun, and with it, the liberation of Western Europe entered a new phase. The impact of Operation Cobra was immediate and profound. German command struggled to regroup, their forces stretched thin and battered by constant bombardment. Hitler's insistence on holding ground at all costs only worsened the situation, preventing tactical withdrawals that might have preserved strength. Instead, German divisions found themselves encircled and cut off, forced to fight in desperate conditions. For the Allies, the success of Cobra was a vindication of patience and strategy, proof that the sacrifices of the hedgerow battles had not been in vain. The path to Paris and beyond was now open. But even as the Allies surged forward, the human cost remained staggering. Villages lay in ruins, their inhabitants displaced or killed. The countryside was scarred by shell craters, burned-out tanks, and shattered farmhouses. Soldiers who had survived the beaches and the hedgerows carried with them memories of comrades lost in fields that seemed ordinary, yet had become killing grounds. Victory, though real, was never simple, and the weight of loss lingered in every step forward. By early August, the Allies had achieved what once seemed impossible. They had broken through the German defenses, shattered the stalemate, and set the stage for the encirclement of German forces in the Falaise pocket. The Battle of Normandy was entering its final, decisive act. Yet the lessons of the hedgerows remained seared into the minds of those who fought there. That victory required not only courage and sacrifice, but also adaptation, innovation, and an unyielding determination to press forward against an enemy who refused to yield. Normandy had become the crucible of liberation, and its story was far from finished. The summer of 1944 had transformed the Normandy campaign from a grinding struggle in the bocage into a sweeping Allied advance across France. Operation Cobra had shattered German defenses, and in its aftermath came one of the most decisive maneuvers of the entire Western Front, the encirclement of German forces in the Falaise pocket. For the Allies, it was a chance to destroy the core of Hitler's army in France, trapping them before they could retreat toward the safety of the Reich. For the Germans, it was a fight for survival, a desperate attempt to escape the jaws of encirclement. In the killing fields of Normandy, the fate of France, and perhaps the entire war in Western Europe, hung in the balance. In early August, the Allies moved swiftly. American forces surged forward toward Le Mans, while British and Canadian troops pressed from the north. The Germans, caught off guard by the sudden speed of the advance, struggled to hold a coherent line. Yet Hitler, still clinging to illusions of counterattack, ordered his generals to launch Operation Luttich, a strike against the American positions near Mortain. The plan was reckless, conceived more from ideology than reality. Exhausted panzer divisions, already mauled in previous battles, were thrown into the offensive. On August 7th, they struck, but the Allies were ready. With overwhelming air superiority, American fighter bombers turned the German advance into chaos. Tanks were destroyed on the roads, and convoys were shredded from the skies. The Mortain offensive collapsed within days, leaving German forces further weakened and exposed. It was at this moment that Allied commanders recognized their opportunity. By pressing east from Argentan and south from Falaise, they could trap the bulk of the German 7th Army and elements of the 5th Panzer Army in a deadly pocket. The encirclement, if completed, promised to annihilate Germany's fighting power in France. General Eisenhower, General Montgomery, and their subordinates coordinated the massive effort, pushing their armies with relentless urgency. Every mile gained tightened the noose, and every delay risked allowing the Germans to slip away. The race to close the Falaise pocket had begun. For the Germans inside the developing pocket, the situation grew increasingly dire. Roads became clogged with retreating vehicles, columns of tanks, trucks, and horse-drawn wagons, all trying to escape eastward. Allied aircraft patrolled the skies relentlessly, striking with devastating accuracy. Pilots later described the battlefield as a scene of unrelenting carnage, where every movement on the roads below drew a storm of rockets and machine gun fire. Civilians fleeing alongside German soldiers found themselves caught in the maelstrom, their carts and belongings abandoned along the roadsides. Survivors remembered the air thick with smoke and the stench of burning fuel and bodies overwhelming. For those trapped, there was no safety, only the hope of reaching the narrowing gap toward escape. The Allies pressed in from all sides. Canadian and Polish forces advanced toward Falaise itself, while American units pushed toward Argentan. Yet coordination proved difficult, and delays emerged as commanders debated how far to push their lines without overextending. These pauses gave the Germans precious hours to funnel men and equipment through the shrinking corridor. Still, the pressure mounted. Villages became battlegrounds. Crossroads turned into slaughterhouses. Every German attempt to break through faced overwhelming firepower from Allied artillery, tanks, and aircraft. By mid-August, the pocket was closing, and tens of thousands of German troops were trapped inside. The Polish 1st Armored Division, under General Stanislaw Maxek, played a critical role in sealing the pocket. Ordered to cut off the German escape routes near Chambois, the Poles fought with extraordinary determination. Facing repeated counterattacks by desperate German units, they held their ground against overwhelming odds. Accounts from Polish soldiers describe the battlefield as apocalyptic, fields littered with corpses, wrecked vehicles, and smoldering ruins. Yet their stand prevented thousands more Germans from escaping. The Canadians, likewise, endured fierce combat, pressing forward through devastated villages and relentless fire to tighten the encirclement. Together, they bore the brunt of the final struggle that would define the Falaise pocket. Inside the pocket, chaos reigned. German officers tried desperately to maintain order, but discipline collapsed as units disintegrated under pressure. Soldiers abandoned heavy weapons, fleeing on foot through fields and forests. Civilians were swept up in the retreat, adding to the confusion. For Allied troops entering the pocket, the scenes they encountered would leave lasting scars. Dead men and animals lay piled along the roads, their bodies bloating in the summer heat. Wrecked tanks and trucks clogged the routes, some still burning days after the battle ended. One Canadian officer described it as a charnel house, where the destruction was so complete that it defied comprehension. Historians would later call it the corridor of death. By August 21st, the encirclement was complete. The German 7th Army was effectively destroyed, with estimates of 50,000 men killed or captured and vast amounts of equipment abandoned. Though some units managed to escape eastward, their losses were catastrophic. The once feared panzer divisions were shattered shadows of themselves, their tanks reduced to twisted hulks littering the countryside. Hitler's dream of holding Normandy had ended not with glory, but with annihilation. For the Allies, the victory was decisive. The road to Paris now lay open, and with it, the liberation of France itself. The psychological impact of the Falaise pocket was immense. For German soldiers, it marked a devastating blow to morale. Survivors spoke of betrayal by their leadership, of being ordered to hold ground long past reason, only to face inevitable destruction. For the Allies, it was proof that their strategy, their coordination, and their overwhelming power could crush even the most formidable enemy. Yet the triumph came at a human cost that could not be ignored. The fields of Normandy, once peaceful, were now cemeteries of men and machines. Civilians who returned to their villages found little left but ruins and death. Liberation carried with it the scars of devastation that as August drew to a close, the Allied armies surged eastward. Paris beckoned, its liberation imminent. But even as victory loomed, commanders knew that the war was far from over. The Germans, though shattered in Normandy, still held strong defensive lines along the Seine and beyond. The battle-hardened Wehrmacht, retreating toward the borders of the Reich, would regroup and fight again. For the soldiers who had endured the inferno of the Falaise pocket, the war pressed relentlessly onward. Their journey through fire and ruin was not yet finished. The guns of Normandy fell silent, but the echoes of the campaign reverberated across Europe and into history. The Allied victory in France had been secured not merely through manpower and courage, but through the relentless ingenuity of engineers and logisticians who transformed mud, rivers, and shattered infrastructure into stepping stones toward Berlin. The story of roads built overnight, of bridges rising where none had stood the day before, was more than a tale of machines and blueprints. It was the story of how modern war was won not only by those pulling triggers, but by those laying asphalt, welding steel, and carving pathways through impossible terrain. For the Japanese in the Pacific, the lesson had been learned with bitter clarity. At Guadalcanal, at New Guinea, and at Leyte, they had watched as Americans transformed jungles into highways, swamps into airfields, and coral reefs into ports of supply. Japanese soldiers spoke of the almost supernatural pace at which American engineers could create permanence from chaos. One account from a Japanese officer captured on Saipan revealed his disbelief. "We dug caves. We prepared for years, and yet they arrived. And in one night, they built roads where none had ever been. For men raised in the traditions of attrition, sacrifice, and static defense, the American reliance on mobility, fueled by engineering, seemed almost alien. Where Japanese armies had struggled to transport supplies on their backs or with thin lines of horse-drawn carts, the Americans unleashed a tide of bulldozers, cranes, and trucks that overwhelmed distance itself. The Germans, too, had been stunned by this phenomenon. During the retreat across France, Wehrmacht reports consistently underestimated the speed of American movement. Intelligence officers speculated that the Allies must have hidden secret stockpiles of roads and bridges, because it defied logic that an entire armored corps could advance so quickly over broken terrain. What the Germans did not grasp was that the Allies carried their infrastructure with them. Portable Bailey bridges, convoys of graders and rollers, mobile sawmills, and prefabricated road mats turned obstacles into inconveniences. A destroyed bridge was not a deterrent. It was merely a challenge, solved within hours by combat engineers who measured victory not in kills, but in kilometers gained. This engineering revolution reshaped strategy itself. In the old wars of Europe, rivers and forests defined the limits of campaigns, dictating where armies could or could not move. But in 1944, the Allies rewrote that rulebook. Roads became arteries of war, carrying fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements with a speed that crushed the possibility of German recovery. Each night, when infantry dug foxholes and tankers cleaned their guns, engineers worked under the cover of darkness, their bulldozers growling like beasts in the night, their welding torches casting sparks against ruined skylines. By dawn, entire divisions awoke to find the world transformed. Supply trucks could reach them, tanks could roll forward, and commanders could plan offensives that would have been unthinkable just years earlier. The psychological effect was as decisive as the physical. To the Allies, engineers embodied progress, hope, and inevitability. Soldiers spoke with reverence of the men in olive-drab coveralls who arrived after every battle, repairing, building, and clearing. They were magicians, one veteran recalled, and without them, we'd still be sitting in Normandy hedgerows. To the enemy, the effect was despair. Every destroyed bridge, every cratered road, and every collapsed tunnel that was meant to slow the Allied advance became useless within hours. German and Japanese commanders saw their efforts evaporate in real time. Their carefully prepared defenses turned into wasted labor. The realization sank deep. They were fighting against an army that not only destroyed but rebuilt, that conquered not only through force of arms but through force of creation. The legacy of this engineering triumph extended far beyond 1945. In the Cold War, NATO armies adopted the doctrine of mobility over static defense, building vast logistical networks designed to sustain movement against any Soviet threat. American military engineering units became permanent fixtures. Their capabilities expanded with new technologies, but grounded in the same principles forged in the mud of Normandy and the jungles of the Pacific. When U.S. forces crossed into Iraq in 1991 during Operation Desert Storm, it was again the engineers who ensured that tanks could move across sand and bridges could carry armored columns at unprecedented speed. Historians tracing the lineage of this operational art point directly to the lessons of World War II, the war where engineers proved as decisive as generals for the nations rebuilt in the war's aftermath. The story held another meaning. The same engineers who had laid down roads under fire now returned home to pave highways, construct schools, and erect cities. The machinery of destruction had become the machinery of reconstruction, transforming Europe and Asia in the post-war decades. Marshall Plan aid brought not only food and currency, but also American know-how and infrastructure, rebuilding nations whose landscapes had been scarred by conflict. Bridges that once bore tanks now bore commerce, and roads that once echoed with gunfire now carried the traffic of peace. The line between combat engineering and civil engineering blurred, and in that blur lay the foundation of the modern world. And yet, at its heart, the tale of overnight roads remains human. It is the story of young men working by lantern light, sweating under the strain of machinery, knowing that every hour they saved might spare a comrade's life. It is the story of units like the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the Seabees of the Navy, the Royal Engineers of Britain, and countless others who risked their lives not with rifles in hand, but with shovels, axes, and torches. Casualty reports remind us that many never returned, killed not only by enemy fire but by the unforgiving dangers of their craft, collapsing bridges, overturned vehicles, and unexploded mines. Their sacrifices were rarely celebrated in headlines. Yet their work underpinned every victory that followed as the war moved toward its inevitable conclusion. The roads built across France and the Pacific stood as silent monuments to their efforts. When Allied tanks rolled into Paris, when columns surged across the Rhine, and when bombers took off from airfields carved out of jungle swamps, all carried with them the imprint of engineering genius. The final defeat of the Axis was as much a triumph of logistics as of combat. Generals may have drawn the arrows on maps, but it was the engineers who ensured those arrows became reality in the ruins of Berlin. In the ashes of Tokyo, the victors could reflect on the profound truth revealed by the war. In modern conflict, destruction and construction are inseparable. The power to rebuild faster than the enemy can destroy is itself a weapon, as decisive as any tank or bomber. And in World War II, it was this weapon that ensured victory. The lesson endures. In today's world of satellites, drones, and cyber warfare, the principle remains unchanged. The ability to connect, to move, to sustain, whether through fiber optic cables or armored convoys, determines the fate of nations. The roads of Normandy, raised overnight in fire and blood, remind us that wars are not only won on battlefields, but in the spaces in between, in the bridges that hold, the runways that endure, and the roads that rise from the dark before dawn. And so the final truth emerges, clear and unyielding. In modern war, connection outweighs firepower and speed defeats armor. It was not simply the men who fought that determined the course of history, but the men who built the paths beneath their feet. In every crushed stone, every steel beam, every mile of road laid against impossible odds, lies the enduring answer to why the Allies triumphed in World War II.